I'm 27F, and if you'd asked me 2 years ago whether I would ever become the other woman, I would have laughed in your face. I considered myself loyal, responsible, the type of person who judged people who cheated. Life has a funny way of testing beliefs you think are permanent. At the time this story began, I had been dating my boyfriend, Ethan, for almost 4 years. We lived together in a small apartment, had a dog together, and were doing what most people call building a future. Nothing was dramatically wrong. That's what made everything so dangerous. There was no screaming, no betrayal, no huge fights, just routine. Every day felt exactly like the previous one. Wake up, work, gym, dinner, Netflix, sleep, repeat. Ethan was dependable, kind, honest. But somewhere along the way, I stopped feeling seen. I never told him that. Partly because I felt guilty for feeling that way. He wasn't doing anything wrong. So instead of talking about it, I buried it. Then Ryan entered the picture. Ryan joined our company as a project manager. He wasn't the most handsome guy in the office. Not even close. But he had confidence. The kind that instantly changes the energy in a room. He remembered everyone's names after meeting them once. He joked with receptionists. He talked to executives like they were old friends. People naturally gravitated toward him, including me. At first, it was harmless. Coffee breaks, team lunches, work conversations that slowly became personal conversations. He asked questions most people don't ask. What do you actually want from life? What would you do if money wasn't an issue? When was the last time you were genuinely excited about something? Those questions stayed with me. More importantly, he listened to the answers. One afternoon, we stayed late finishing a project. The office was almost empty. Rain was hitting the windows. Everyone else had gone home. We sat across from each other reviewing reports when he suddenly looked up. "You seem unhappy." I laughed. "That's a little dramatic." He shook his head. "No. You seem like someone pretending everything is fine." The weird thing? He wasn't wrong. Nobody had noticed. Not my friends. Not my family. Not even Ethan. But somehow this coworker I'd known for a few months saw through me immediately. Or at least I believed he did. Looking back now, that's when the trouble started. Not because anything physical happened. Nothing did. The problem was emotional. I started looking forward to seeing Ryan. Checking whether he'd messaged. Wondering if he'd be at meetings. Thinking about conversations we'd had. I told myself it wasn't cheating because we weren't crossing any obvious lines. No flirting. No touching. No secrets. At least that's what I claimed. But deep down I knew something had changed. Because when Ethan asked how my day was, I talked about Ryan more than anyone else. Weeks passed. Then months. The connection grew. One evening Ryan invited several coworkers out for drinks after work. Nothing unusual. Half the office attended. We laughed. Shared stories. Stayed later than expected. Eventually people started leaving. One by one. Until only Ryan and I remained. Neither of us seemed eager to end the night. The conversation shifted from work to relationships. Then fears. Regrets. Dreams. The vulnerable stuff people usually hide. At some point he looked at me carefully and said, "Your boyfriend is lucky." I felt my stomach tighten. I should have changed the subject. Instead I asked, "Why?" He smiled slightly. "Because someone else would have noticed your value a long time ago." I wish I could say I shut it down immediately. I didn't. Because hearing that felt good. Too good. For the first time in months, I felt attractive. Interesting. Important. And that feeling became addictive. The next morning, I woke up with a knot in my stomach. I knew I was standing at the beginning of something dangerous. The responsible choice would have been creating distance. Setting boundaries. Focusing on my relationship. Instead, I did the opposite. And what I didn't know yet was that Ryan wouldn't be the only man who would completely change my life. Because a few weeks later, another person would enter the story. A person who would make Ryan look harmless by comparison. And when both of them became involved with me at the same time, everything fell apart. A lot of people reading this will probably think Ryan was the real problem. At the time, I thought so too. He was the first crack in the foundation. The first secret. The first person who made me question whether my relationship with Ethan was really as perfect as I pretended. But Ryan wasn't the person who destroyed everything. That title belongs to someone else. Someone I never expected. A month after the drinks night, work sent me to a 3-day professional conference in another city. Nothing exciting. Just presentations, networking events, and endless conversations about industry trends. Ryan was supposed to attend too. At the last minute, his flight got canceled because of a family emergency. I remember feeling disappointed. More disappointed than I should have been. That realization bothered me. I kept telling myself it wasn't because I had feelings for him. I just enjoyed having a friend there. At least that's what I repeated in my head. The conference itself was painfully boring. The first day felt like it lasted a week. By evening, I was exhausted. The organizers hosted a networking reception at the hotel rooftop bar. I almost skipped it. Looking back, I wish I had. Around an hour after arriving, I met Daniel. 31. Consultant. Smart. Funny. Dangerously easy to talk to. We started discussing a presentation we'd both attended earlier that day. Then travel. Then careers. Then everything else. One conversation became 2 hours without either of us noticing. Unlike Ryan, who always seemed effortlessly confident, Daniel felt different. More grounded. More relaxed. Less interested in impressing people. That made him surprisingly attractive. At some point, he asked whether I wanted another drink. I accepted. Then another. Then another. Nothing inappropriate happened. But I noticed something unsettling. I wasn't comparing Daniel to Ryan. I was comparing him to Ethan. And for the first time in years, Ethan wasn't winning those comparisons. That realization scared me. So I returned to my hotel room early. I told myself I needed space, distance, perspective. Instead, I spent half the night replaying conversations in my head. The next morning, Daniel found me before the first presentation. "Coffee?" he asked. I should have declined. Instead, I smiled. Sure. That became our routine. Coffee before sessions. Lunch between presentations. Conversations after events. 3 days passed incredibly fast. Too fast. On the final evening, everyone gathered for a farewell dinner. As the night ended, people exchanged contact information. LinkedIn profiles. Business cards. Phone numbers. Professional networking. Normal stuff. Daniel handed me his phone. I stared at it for a second. A tiny decision. One that should have been meaningless. But something inside me knew otherwise. I entered my number. The moment felt strangely important. Like crossing an invisible line. Back home, life returned to normal. Or at least it appeared normal. Ethan greeted me at the airport. The dog nearly tackled me with excitement. Laundry piled up. Work resumed. The routine returned. But my phone started lighting up more frequently. Ryan messaged. Daniel messaged. And I replied to both. At first, the conversations were innocent. Work updates. Funny stories. Random observations. Nothing I couldn't theoretically show Ethan. Yet somehow I never did. Because the problem wasn't the messages themselves. The problem was how much I anticipated receiving them. One evening, Ethan walked into the living room unexpectedly while I was smiling at my phone. "What's so funny?" he asked. I immediately locked the screen. My stomach dropped. It happened automatically. Without thinking. Without planning. Just instinct. His expression changed slightly. Not suspicious. Just curious. "Nobody," I said. And technically that was my first lie. A tiny one. Almost insignificant. But lies rarely stay small. Weeks passed. Ryan became more openly flirtatious. Not aggressively. Just subtle comments. Compliments. Inside jokes. Little moments that blurred boundaries. Meanwhile, Daniel lived hundreds of miles away. Yet, somehow our conversations became deeper. More personal. We talked late into the night. Sometimes until 1 or 2 in the morning. One Friday evening, Daniel asked a question that changed everything. "Are you happy?" Simple question. For words. I stared at the screen for several minutes. Because I didn't know the answer. Or maybe I did. Maybe I just didn't want to admit it. Eventually I typed, "I don't know anymore." 3 dots appeared immediately, then disappeared, then appeared again. Finally his response arrived. That's usually an answer by itself. I hated how accurate that felt. The following weekend Ethan suggested we spend Saturday together. Just us. No phones. No errands. No distractions. A date day. Something we hadn't done in months. I agreed immediately. And honestly, it was wonderful. We walked through the city, ate at our favorite restaurant, talked for hours, laughed, held hands. For the first time in a long time, I remembered why I fell in love with him. Driving home that evening, I felt relieved. Maybe I had overreacted. Maybe relationships naturally went through phases. Maybe everything was fine after all. Then my phone buzzed. One message from Ryan. Another from Daniel. And without hesitation, I checked them. The guilt hit instantly. Because I realized something disturbing. Even after spending an amazing day with my boyfriend, the first people I wanted validation from weren't him. They were them. That was the moment I stopped pretending this was harmless. I knew I was emotionally involved. Maybe not physically. Not yet. But emotionally? Absolutely. And things became even more complicated a week later. Because Ryan finally confessed something he'd been hiding from me. Something that should have made me walk away immediately. Instead, it pulled me even deeper into the mess. When people ask where everything truly went wrong, they usually expect a dramatic answer. A kiss. A hotel room. A huge betrayal. But in reality, most disasters begin with conversations. One honest conversation at the wrong time can change everything. A week after I admitted to myself that my feelings were no longer innocent, Ryan asked if we could talk after work. His message seemed unusually serious. For a moment, I wondered whether he had noticed the distance I'd been trying to create. I had started replying less often, keeping conversations shorter, trying to convince myself I could still regain control of the situation. We met at a quiet cafe near the office. Ryan looked nervous. That alone surprised me. I'd never seen him nervous before. After a few minutes of awkward small talk, he finally sighed. "I need to tell you something." My stomach tightened. Immediately, I assumed the worst. Maybe he had feelings for me. Maybe he'd noticed I felt the same. Maybe this was the conversation I'd been secretly expecting for months. Instead, he said something completely different. "I'm getting divorced." For a moment, I simply stared at him. I didn't even know he was married. He laughed bitterly. Most people don't. The next hour passed in a blur. He explained that the separation had started long before he joined the company. According to him, the relationship had been effectively over for years. Paperwork was simply catching up with reality. I listened carefully. Sympathetically. Too sympathetically. Because instead of seeing a warning sign, I saw vulnerability. Pain. Someone struggling. Someone who trusted me. Looking back, that's exactly how emotional boundaries disappear. You stop seeing danger. You start seeing justification. When we finally left the cafe, the atmosphere between us felt different. More personal. More intimate. Not romantic. At least not officially. But something had shifted. An invisible line moved. And neither of us acknowledged it. Meanwhile, Daniel continued messaging almost every day. The difference was that Daniel didn't seem interested in emotional complications. He was straightforward. Confident. Easy. Talking to him felt like escaping reality for a few minutes each day. Then one Thursday evening, he sent a message that nearly made me drop my phone. "Guess who's visiting your city next month?" I stared at the screen. My heart immediately accelerated. I hated that reaction. Because I already knew what it meant. Part of me wanted to see him. A very large part. Trying to sound casual, I replied, "Business trip." Partly. Then another message appeared. "Maybe I also wanted an excuse to see you." I read that sentence at least 10 times. Every reasonable voice inside my head screamed that this was becoming dangerous. Yet I couldn't stop smiling. That scared me more than the message itself. For the next several weeks, I lived 2 separate lives. At home, I was Ethan's girlfriend. At work, I was Ryan's closest confidant. On my phone, I was becoming something else entirely with Daniel. Each version of me felt slightly different, and maintaining all three became exhausting. The lies were still small, but they were multiplying. Where are you? Who are you texting? Why are you smiling? Simple questions. Complicated answers. One night, Ethan casually asked, "Have we been okay lately?" The question caught me completely off guard. "What do you mean?" He shrugged. "I don't know. You seem distracted sometimes." I immediately denied it. Too quickly. Too defensively. His expression changed. Just for a second. Not suspicion. Concern. And that made the guilt even worse. Because Ethan wasn't accusing me of anything. He was trying to reconnect. Meanwhile, I was slowly drifting away. A few days later, Daniel's travel plans became official. He sent flight details, hotel information, meeting schedules. The trip was real. Suddenly, there was a date on the calendar. An actual day. No longer hypothetical. No longer distant. Real. That realization hit harder than expected. Because until then, everything existed safely behind screens. Messages. Calls. Imagination. Now there would be reality. And reality forces decisions. The night before Daniel arrived, I barely slept. Part of me considered canceling entirely. Making an excuse. Creating distance. Doing the responsible thing. But another voice kept asking a dangerous question. What if you're throwing away something important? People justify bad decisions in fascinating ways. They rarely think, "I want to betray someone." Instead, they think, "I deserve happiness. I just need closure. We're only meeting as friends." That's exactly what I told myself. Friends. Nothing more. The next afternoon, I walked toward a downtown cafe where we'd agreed to meet. Every step felt heavier than the last. I almost turned around twice. Then I saw him, standing outside, looking exactly like I remembered. He smiled immediately. And for a brief second, I forgot every promise I'd made to myself. Because something dangerous happened in that moment. Something far worse than attraction. It felt easy, natural, comfortable, like we'd known each other for years. And as we sat down together, laughing as if no time had passed at all, I had no idea that Ryan was about to discover Daniel existed. And once that happened, the situation would stop being a secret involving two people. It would become a disaster involving four. Meeting Daniel in person was supposed to make things easier. That was the lie I told myself. I thought seeing him face to face would either confirm my feelings or eliminate them. Reality did neither. It complicated everything. The afternoon began innocently enough. Coffee turned into a walk through the city. The walk turned into dinner. Dinner turned into hours of conversation. There was never a moment where either of us officially crossed a line. No dramatic declaration. No movie-style confession. Just a growing awareness that neither of us wanted the evening to end. That realization sat between us the entire night. Unspoken. Dangerous. By the time I returned home, Ethan was already asleep on the couch. The television still played quietly in the background. A blanket covered half of him. One hand rested on the dog curled beside him. The sight hit me harder than expected. For a moment, I simply stood there, looking at the life we'd built together. The comfort, the stability, the years of memories. And suddenly I felt awful. Not because of anything that had happened, but because of what I wanted to happen. I quietly went upstairs and barely slept. The next morning, Daniel messaged me. Then again at lunch. Then again that evening. The frequency felt different now. More personal. More intentional. And despite every warning sign, I kept responding. 3 days later, he flew home. I expected the connection to fade. Instead, it intensified. Meanwhile, Ryan noticed something had changed. He wasn't stupid. Far from it. One afternoon at work, he casually asked, "How was your conference friend?" I nearly froze. The question sounded innocent. But something about the way he asked it felt deliberate. "What conference friend?" He smiled. "The guy you've been texting constantly." My stomach dropped. Apparently, I wasn't nearly as subtle as I thought. I tried to laugh it off. Failed miserably. Ryan studied my face. For a few uncomfortable seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said, "You like him?" Not a question. A statement. I should have denied it. Instead, I looked away. And that silence answered everything. Ryan leaned back in his chair. His expression wasn't angry. It was disappointed, which somehow felt worse. "What are you doing?" he asked. The question irritated me immediately. Maybe because I didn't have a good answer. "What do you mean?" "I mean him. Your boyfriend. All of this." I hated hearing someone else say it aloud. Because suddenly my situation sounded exactly as messy as it actually was. Ryan shook his head. "You're going to hurt somebody." I wanted to argue. Defend myself. Explain how complicated everything felt. But deep down I knew he was right. The only question was who would get hurt first. The answer arrived sooner than expected. A week later, Ethan asked to borrow my phone. A completely normal request. His battery had died. He needed directions. Nothing suspicious. Nothing unusual. Yet the moment he asked, panic exploded inside me. Instant panic. The kind that's impossible to hide. He noticed immediately. His eyes narrowed slightly. "Why are you acting weird?" "I'm not." "You definitely are." My heart hammered against my ribs. Most of the conversations were harmless. But there were enough emotional messages from both Ryan and Daniel to raise uncomfortable questions. Questions I wasn't ready to answer. Eventually, I handed him the phone, trying to appear calm. Inside, I was terrified. Thankfully, he only opened the map application. 2 minutes later, he handed it back. No issue. No confrontation. Nothing happened. But the damage was already done. Because now Ethan had seen my reaction. And reactions are often more revealing than evidence. Over the following days, he became quieter. More observant. More attentive. Not controlling. Not accusatory. Just aware. And that made me nervous. One Friday night, we went to dinner together. Halfway through the meal, he asked, "Are you happy?" The exact same question Daniel had asked weeks earlier. I nearly dropped my fork. The coincidence felt surreal. For several seconds, I couldn't speak. Ethan watched carefully, waiting. Finally, I answered, "Of course." Another lie. Maybe the biggest one so far. Not because I was unhappy with him, but because I genuinely didn't know what I felt anymore. Confusion had replaced certainty. And confusion makes people dangerous. That same weekend, Ryan sent me a message late at night. A simple message. Only one sentence. "I think you're falling for someone who doesn't really know you." I stared at the screen. Then typed a reply. Deleted it. Typed another. Deleted that too. Because the uncomfortable truth was that Ryan wasn't entirely wrong. Daniel knew the version of me that existed outside responsibility. Outside routines. Outside ordinary life. He knew the exciting version. The idealized version. Not the real one. Yet despite understanding that, I couldn't stop thinking about him. Then, on Monday morning, everything changed. Daniel called unexpectedly. His voice sounded unusually serious. Almost nervous. After a brief pause, he said, "I need to tell you something before you hear it from someone else." My stomach immediately sank. Whenever conversations begin like that, nothing good follows. And what he told me next would completely reshape the entire situation. Because Daniel had been hiding something too. Something that connected him to my life in a way neither of us had realized. And once that secret came out, there would be no going back. When Daniel said he needed to tell me something before I heard it from someone else, my mind immediately jumped to the worst possibilities. A girlfriend. A wife. A criminal record. Some hidden detail that would instantly explain why everything felt too good to be true. I sat in my car outside work listening to his voice through the speakers. The pause before he spoke felt endless. Then he said, "I know someone at your company." I blinked. That wasn't what I expected. Okay. Actually, more than know them. Another pause. My older brother works there. For several seconds, I thought he was joking. My company wasn't huge, but it wasn't tiny either. Hundreds of employees. Multiple departments. Several locations. The odds seemed ridiculous. Who? When he answered, my stomach dropped. Because I knew the name immediately. Not well, but well enough. We had attended meetings together. Passed each other in hallways. exchanged emails. The connection wasn't close, but it existed. And suddenly my separate worlds no longer felt separate. Daniel explained that his brother had recently mentioned me during a conversation. Apparently my name had come up in relation to a project. Nothing dramatic. Nothing suspicious. But enough for Daniel to realize the connection. I didn't know whether to tell you. I rubbed my forehead. Everything suddenly felt much smaller. Much riskier. Before, Daniel had existed safely outside my everyday life. Now there was a direct line connecting him to my workplace. To Ryan. Potentially even to people who knew Ethan. The distance that had made everything feel manageable disappeared instantly. After we ended the call, I sat in silence for several minutes, trying to process the situation, trying to decide whether this changed anything. The answer should have been obvious. It should have been the perfect reason to step back, to create boundaries, to end whatever emotional mess I was building. Instead, I did what I'd been doing for months. Nothing. I delayed decisions, hoped problems would solve themselves. And as usual, they became worse. That afternoon Ryan noticed I seemed distracted. Again. He waited until we were alone. You okay? I considered lying, then decided against it. At least partially. I told him about Daniel's brother working at the company. Ryan listened quietly. His reaction surprised me, because instead of looking shocked, he looked concerned. Very concerned. That's not good. Why? He hesitated, then sighed. Because situations like this never stay private forever. I wanted to argue, but I couldn't. Not honestly. Deep down I already knew he was right. The problem was that knowing something is dangerous doesn't automatically make you stop. Sometimes it only makes the danger feel more exciting. I hate admitting that, but it's true. The following week became a blur of stress. Every notification made me nervous. Every unexpected conversation felt suspicious. Every glance from Ethan seemed more observant than before. Maybe nothing had changed. Maybe the paranoia existed entirely in my head. But guilt changes perception. You start seeing consequences everywhere. One evening Ethan and I attended a birthday party for one of his friends. Normal gathering. Food. Music. Conversation. Nothing unusual. Yet I spent most of the night checking my phone. Trying not to. Failing repeatedly. Eventually Ethan noticed. Of course he did. He always noticed more than I gave him credit for. At one point he quietly asked, "Is something going on?" My chest tightened. There it was. The question I'd been avoiding for months. The question I knew would eventually arrive. And for a second, I considered telling him everything. Not every detail, but enough. Enough to be honest. Enough to stop carrying secrets. Enough to maybe save what remained of our relationship. The words almost left my mouth. Then fear took over. Fear of hurting him. Fear of losing him. Fear of facing consequences. So I smiled. And lied again. No, just work stuff. He nodded slowly. But I could tell he didn't fully believe me. That realization stayed with me long after the party ended. For the first time, I began wondering whether the real damage wasn't the attraction, or the messages, or even the emotional attachment. Maybe the real damage was becoming someone who lied so easily. Someone I barely recognized. A few days later Daniel called again. This conversation felt different. More serious. More direct. Eventually he asked the question I had secretly known was coming. What exactly are we doing? Silence filled the line. Because I didn't have an answer. Friendship no longer felt accurate. But neither did anything else. The truth existed somewhere in the uncomfortable space between. Daniel waited patiently. Finally I admitted. I don't know. He laughed softly. That's the problem. He wasn't wrong. We had spent months building something undefined. Something emotional. Something meaningful. Yet nobody wanted to name it. Because naming things creates responsibility. And responsibility demands decisions. Then Daniel said something that changed everything. Not dramatic. Not romantic. Just honest. I don't want to be someone's secret forever. My stomach dropped. Because suddenly I understood where this was heading. Toward a choice. An actual choice. Not someday. Not eventually. Soon. And I wasn't prepared. The next morning I arrived at work exhausted. Mentally drained. Emotionally scattered. I expected an ordinary day. Instead, I walked into the office and immediately saw Ryan standing near reception, talking to someone. A man I recognized from photographs. Daniel's brother. The connection hit me instantly. The room suddenly felt smaller. The situation suddenly felt real. And as Ryan turned toward me with a confused expression, I realized something terrifying. The separate parts of my life were finally colliding. And once those worlds met, keeping everything hidden would become almost impossible. The moment I saw Ryan talking to Daniel's brother, my stomach dropped. Not because they were discussing me. At least, I didn't think they were. It was because, for the first time, the walls separating different parts of my life felt paper-thin. One mistake. One careless comment. One coincidence. That was all it would take. Ryan noticed me standing there and waved me over. I considered pretending not to see him. Too late. Morning, he said. Daniel's brother smiled politely and introduced himself, unaware that I already knew exactly who he was. I returned the greeting and somehow survived the conversation without acting suspicious. But the entire exchange left me rattled. For the rest of the day, I couldn't focus. Every notification made me jump. Every email felt urgent. Every conversation seemed loaded with hidden meaning. When I got home that evening, Ethan was sitting at the kitchen table, waiting. Immediately, I knew something was wrong. The atmosphere felt different. Heavy. Still. Uncomfortable. He wasn't angry. Not yet. That somehow scared me more. Hey, I said carefully. Hey. His voice sounded calm. Too calm. I sat down across from him. Neither of us spoke for several seconds. Then he asked, "Who's Daniel?" The question hit like a punch. Everything inside me froze. For a second, I genuinely couldn't breathe. There it was. The moment I'd been dreading for months. Not because I'd been caught doing something physical. Nothing like that had happened. But because the secrets were finally becoming visible. I forced myself to remain calm. How do you know that name? Wrong answer. The second the words left my mouth, I knew it. Ethan's expression changed. Just slightly. But enough. You didn't answer my question. My heart hammered against my ribs. Apparently, a message notification had appeared on my tablet while I was in another room. Nothing explicit. Nothing dramatic. But enough. Enough to raise questions. Enough for him to notice a name he'd never heard before. I could have lied again. Invented another explanation. Created another temporary escape. Instead, for the first time in months, I told part of the truth. He's someone I met at a conference. Silence. How often do you talk? I hesitated. Huge mistake. Because hesitation answered the question before I did. Ethan looked away. Not angry. Not shouting. Just disappointed. And somehow that hurt more. How long? The questions kept coming. Reasonable questions. Questions I deserved. Questions I had no good answers for. Eventually I admitted that we'd been talking for months. The room became very quiet. For several moments neither of us moved. Then Ethan asked the hardest question yet. Do you have feelings for him? I wanted to say no. I wanted everything to return to normal. I wanted the last several months to disappear. But I was exhausted. Exhausted from hiding. Exhausted from lying. Exhausted from pretending confusion wasn't already an answer. I don't know, I said quietly. The moment the words left my mouth, I saw the damage. Not anger. Pain. Real pain. The kind that appears when someone hears exactly what they feared. Ethan stood up and walked toward the living room. For a moment I thought he was leaving. Instead, he simply stood near the window staring outside. When he finally spoke again, his voice sounded tired. Then maybe you need to figure it out. That sentence lingered in the air long after the conversation ended. Because he was right. I did need to figure it out. The problem was that figuring it out meant someone would get hurt. Maybe everyone. The next day, I barely slept, barely ate, barely functioned. Then Ryan called. Apparently Daniel's brother had mentioned me during their conversation. Nothing suspicious. Just enough for Ryan to realize the connection. Enough to realize Daniel wasn't some distant acquaintance anymore. Enough to understand the situation was becoming serious. After work we met for coffee. Ryan listened while I explained what happened with Ethan. When I finished, he sighed heavily. "You can't keep living between decisions." I laughed bitterly. "Apparently not." For a moment neither of us spoke. Then Ryan said something unexpected. "Whatever choice you make it honestly. No judgment. No manipulation. No attempt to influence me. Just honesty." And hearing that somehow made everything harder. Because for months I'd convinced myself circumstances were responsible. Timing. Confusion. Bad luck. But sitting there across from Ryan, I finally accepted an uncomfortable truth. The situation existed because of my choices, not anyone else's. Mine. That evening Daniel called. I almost ignored it. Almost. Instead I answered. After a few minutes of conversation, I told him the truth. Ethan knew about him. At least partly. The silence on the other end felt endless. Then Daniel quietly said, "I guess that means things are changing." "Yes. Are you okay?" I stared at the ceiling. No. For once, the answer was simple. No. I wasn't okay. Nothing about the situation felt okay anymore. The excitement had faded. The uncertainty remained. And for the first time since all of this began, I realized something important. I wasn't afraid of choosing. I was afraid of consequences. But consequences were already here. And within days, I would be forced to make a decision I could no longer postpone. A decision that would permanently change every relationship involved. For months, I had convinced myself that I was figuring things out. That phrase became my shield. My excuse. My escape route. Whenever guilt appeared, I told myself I was confused. Whenever responsibility appeared, I told myself I needed more time. Whenever decisions appeared, I delayed them. But eventually time stops helping. Eventually it starts making everything worse. That was where I found myself. Nobody was forcing me anymore. Reality was. 3 days after Ethan discovered the messages, he asked if we could talk. Not argue. Not fight. Talk. The request alone told me how serious things had become. We sat across from each other at the kitchen table where we'd shared thousands of ordinary conversations over the years. Dinner plans. Vacation ideas. Bills. Work stories. Life. Now the atmosphere felt completely different. Ethan looked exhausted. Not physically. Emotionally. I knew I was responsible for that. For a long moment neither of us spoke. Then he finally said, "I need an honest answer." My stomach tightened immediately. Because I already knew the question. Do you still want this relationship? Simple. Direct. Impossible. Or at least it felt impossible. The problem wasn't that I didn't care about Ethan. I did. Deeply. The problem was that caring about someone isn't always the same thing as choosing them. That realization felt brutal. For years I'd assumed love automatically solved everything. Now I wasn't so sure. "I don't know," I whispered. The moment I said it, I regretted it. Not because it was untrue. Because it was inadequate. Months of uncertainty reduced to 3 miserable words. Ethan closed his eyes briefly. Then nodded. Slowly. Almost sadly. "I think that's my answer." Hearing him say that terrified me. For the first time, losing him felt real. Not theoretical. Not future tense. Real. Immediate. And suddenly I wanted to stop it. To promise things would improve. To tell him I would fix everything. But promises felt meaningless when I still didn't understand my own feelings. So I remained silent. That silence said everything. Afterward, he left to stay with a friend for a few days. Not permanently. At least not yet. But the empty apartment felt different immediately. The absence was impossible to ignore. His shoes weren't by the door. His coffee mug wasn't on the counter. His laugh wasn't filling the rooms. And for the first time in months, I was completely alone with my thoughts. I hated it. Because without distractions, I could no longer pretend. The next evening Daniel called. I told him what happened. He listened quietly. Then asked a question nobody else had asked. "What do you want?" Not who. Not what relationship. Not what outcome. What do you want? I sat there staring at the wall, unable to answer. Because somewhere along the way I'd become obsessed with managing consequences instead of understanding myself. I wasn't making choices based on desire. I was making choices based on fear. Fear of hurting Ethan. Fear of losing stability. Fear of making mistakes. Fear of regretting decisions. Fear. 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 Daniel eventually broke the silence. You don't have to answer right now. But I knew I did. Not necessarily to him. To myself. A few days later, Ryan invited me for coffee. By then he already understood most of the situation. Not every detail. Enough. When I explained everything that had happened, he surprised me again. He laughed. Not cruelly. Almost sympathetically. What? He shook his head. You spent months trying to avoid hurting people. Yeah. And somehow everyone got hurt anyway. The observation stung because it was true. Pain delayed isn't always pain prevented. Sometimes it's pain multiplied. That conversation stayed with me for days. Especially because Ryan wasn't judging me. He was simply describing reality. Eventually the weekend arrived. And with it, a decision. Not because I suddenly achieved perfect clarity. Life doesn't work that way. Sometimes decisions happen because continuing exactly as you are becomes impossible. That Saturday morning I woke up early. Made coffee. Sat alone in silence. And finally admitted something I'd spent months avoiding. The relationship I had with Ethan wasn't failing because of Daniel. Or Ryan. Or bad timing. It had been struggling long before any of them appeared. I simply hadn't wanted to acknowledge it. Meeting other people exposed cracks. It didn't create them. That realization changed everything. Because suddenly the question wasn't, which man should I choose? The real question was, am I staying in a relationship because I genuinely want it or because I'm afraid to leave it? For the first time, I knew the answer. And once I knew it, the next step became unavoidable. That evening I called Ethan. My hands shook the entire time. When he answered, neither of us spoke immediately. Then I quietly asked, can we meet tomorrow? He agreed. No argument. No questions. Just agreement. And after hanging up, I sat there staring at my phone, knowing that the conversation waiting for us would change both of our lives. Because sometimes there isn't a perfect choice. Only an honest one. And honesty was finally catching up with me. I barely slept the night before meeting Ethan. Every possible version of the conversation played through my head. In some versions he was angry. In others he was devastated. Sometimes he walked away before I finished speaking. Sometimes he forgave me. Sometimes I changed my mind entirely. The problem with imagining difficult conversations is that reality almost never follows the script. And reality had one more surprise waiting for me. We met Sunday afternoon at a small park near our apartment. A place we'd visited dozens of times over the years. Normally it felt peaceful. That day it felt like a courtroom. Ethan arrived a few minutes early. He looked tired. Older somehow. Not physically. Emotionally. I hated knowing I had contributed to that. For several moments neither of us spoke. Then I took a deep breath. And finally said what I'd spent months avoiding. I don't think our relationship has been working for a long time. The words sounded colder out loud than they had in my head. Ethan didn't react immediately. He simply listened. So I continued. I told him about feeling disconnected. About routine replacing intimacy. About how we'd slowly stopped talking about important things. How we'd become partners in life, but less connected as people. I didn't blame him. Because honestly, the responsibility belonged to both of us. Relationships rarely deteriorate because of one person alone. The problems had existed long before Daniel appeared. Long before Ryan. Long before any of the confusion. When I finally finished speaking, Ethan nodded slowly. Then he said something I never expected. I know. I stared at him. What? I know. The calmness in his voice shocked me. For months I'd been carrying this secret belief that I was the only one aware of the distance between us. Apparently I was wrong. Very wrong. Ethan looked down briefly before continuing. I noticed it a long time ago. The admission hit harder than I expected. Because suddenly all the loneliness I'd been carrying wasn't mine alone. He'd been feeling it too. Neither of us had said anything. Neither of us had addressed it. We'd both hoped things would somehow improve on their own. They didn't. For nearly an hour, we talked more honestly than we had in years. No accusations. No shouting. Just truth. Uncomfortable truth. Necessary truth. Eventually, the conversation reached the question both of us knew was waiting. What happens now? I wish I could say I had a confident answer. I didn't. But I knew one thing. The relationship couldn't continue exactly as it was. Not after everything. Not after months of uncertainty. Not after secrets and distance and unanswered questions. So we agreed to separate. At least temporarily. No dramatic breakup scene. No slammed doors. Just two people acknowledging reality. It hurt more than I expected. As we stood to leave, Ethan surprised me again. You know, he said quietly, I don't think Daniel is the real issue. I froze. His expression remained calm. Sad, but calm. I think Daniel just forced you to admit things you were already feeling. I couldn't argue. Because deep down I knew he was right. The walk home felt surreal. Part of me felt relieved. Part of me felt devastated. Mostly I felt empty. For months I'd imagined reaching a decision would bring clarity. Instead it brought uncertainty. That evening I called Daniel. He answered immediately. I told him everything. The conversation with Ethan. The separation. The decision. When I finished speaking, silence filled the line. Then Daniel quietly asked, How do you feel? I considered the question carefully. Sad. Anything else? Scared. Another pause. Then, that's probably normal. His response was reasonable. Supportive. Kind. Yet, something felt different. Something I couldn't identify. At first I ignored it. Then over the following week, the feeling grew stronger. Our conversations became shorter. Less frequent. Less natural. Not intentionally. At least I don't think so. The energy had changed. And eventually I understood why. For months, Daniel had existed partly as possibility. A future. An alternative. An unanswered question. Now the question had an answer. Reality had replaced fantasy. And reality carries weight that imagination doesn't. One evening, about 2 weeks after my conversation with Ethan, Daniel called unexpectedly. His voice sounded serious. Immediately my stomach tightened. Because I'd learned something over the past few months. Important conversations rarely announce themselves. But you usually feel them coming. After a brief pause, he said, I think we need to talk about expectations. The sentence alone made my heart sink. Not because it was unreasonable. Because I already knew where it was heading. And for the second time in a matter of weeks, I found myself facing another difficult truth. One that would force me to reevaluate everything all over again. Because sometimes the thing you spend months believing you want turns out to be very different once it becomes possible. For most of the previous year, Daniel had represented possibility. Not a relationship. Not exactly. More like an unanswered question. A road I hadn't taken. A version of life that existed entirely in theory. And theories are easy to romanticize. Reality is harder. When Daniel said we needed to discuss expectations, I knew something had changed. I just didn't know what. We arranged a video call later that evening. The moment his face appeared on screen, I could tell he was nervous. That immediately made me nervous too. For several minutes, we exchanged meaningless small talk. Neither of us wanted to start the real conversation. Eventually he did. I think we've both been imagining different things. Direct. Honest. Painfully accurate. I sat quietly and waited. Daniel leaned back in his chair. For months we've been talking about possibilities. I nodded. Yeah, but possibilities are easy. Another nod. Because he wasn't wrong. Possibilities contain no bills. No schedules. No compromises. No difficult realities. Only imagination. Daniel sighed. I don't actually know what a relationship with you looks like. The statement surprised me. Not because it was negative. Because it was true. Brutally true. We knew each other emotionally. We knew each other's stories. Dreams. Fears. Goals. But we didn't know ordinary life together. We'd never argued about chores. Never navigated stressful weeks. never experienced the boring realities that form actual relationships. We knew potential, not reality. That distinction suddenly felt enormous. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Daniel said something that changed how I viewed everything. I don't want to become someone's escape. I frowned. What do you mean? He thought carefully before answering. For a long time, talking to me represented freedom from problems. The words hit harder than expected. Because there was truth inside them. Not complete truth, but enough. When my relationship with Ethan felt stagnant, Daniel represented excitement. When life felt repetitive, Daniel represented novelty. When I felt unseen, Daniel made me feel noticed. Those feelings were real. But were they enough to build a future? I wasn't sure anymore. And for the first time, neither was he. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. No argument. No dramatic ending. Just honesty. The kind of honesty that strips away fantasy. By the time we finished talking, both of us understood something important. Neither of us should rush into a relationship simply because we'd spent months imagining one. Reality deserved more respect than that. The call ended on good terms. But emotionally, everything felt uncertain again. A few days later, I met Ryan for coffee. By then, he knew about my separation from Ethan. He also knew Daniel and I were trying to figure things out. As usual, Ryan listened more than he talked. Eventually, he asked, "Do you know what's interesting?" I shook my head. "You keep describing this as choosing between people." I frowned. "Isn't it?" "No." His answer came immediately. Confidently. I waited for him to continue. Ryan stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "You're acting like your only options are Ethan or Daniel." I blinked. Because I suddenly realized I'd been doing exactly that. For months. Maybe longer. Ryan continued. "What if neither answer is correct right now?" The statement caught me completely off guard. Not because it was complicated. Because it was simple. Painfully simple. For nearly a year, my attention had been focused entirely outward. Which relationship? Which future? Which person? I had barely considered another possibility. Being alone. Not forever. Just long enough to understand myself without external influence. The idea felt strange. Uncomfortable. Yet oddly peaceful. Ryan smiled slightly. "I think you've spent so much time reacting to relationships that you forgot to ask who you're outside them." That conversation stayed with me for days. Long after the coffee ended. Long after we went home. Because deep down, I knew he had identified something important. Ever since college, I'd moved directly from one serious relationship to another. There had always been a partner. Always a future plan. Always a shared identity. Maybe that wasn't inherently bad. But maybe I'd never truly learned who I was independently. The realization felt unsettling. And liberating. A week later, I met Ethan one final time to discuss practical matters. The apartment. The lease. Shared belongings. All the boring logistics that follow emotional decisions. The conversation was surprisingly calm. Neither of us pretended things hadn't happened. Neither of us tried rewriting history. Instead, we acknowledged something simple. Our relationship had been meaningful. Important. Real. Even if it wasn't permanent. As we finished talking, Ethan smiled sadly. "You know," he said, "I think we'll both be okay." For the first time in months, I believed that too. Not immediately. Not painlessly. But eventually. Walking home afterward, I felt something unfamiliar. Not happiness. Not relief. Something quieter. Acceptance. For the first time since all of this began, I wasn't chasing answers. I wasn't avoiding decisions. I wasn't managing secrets. I was simply moving forward. And the final lesson waiting for me would arrive sooner than expected. Because several months later, I would unexpectedly cross paths with both Daniel and Ryan again. And those meetings would reveal whether I'd actually learned anything from the chaos I'd created. People love clean endings. They want dramatic conclusions. A clear winner. A perfect relationship. A lesson wrapped neatly in certainty. Real life rarely works that way. The months following my separation from Ethan were some of the strangest of my life. Not because something dramatic happened. Because nothing dramatic happened. For the first time in years, I was completely responsible for myself. No partner. No relationship to maintain. No emotional triangle. No constant uncertainty. Just me. At first, the silence felt uncomfortable. Then it became peaceful. I started rebuilding routines that belonged to me instead of us. Weekend trips. New hobbies. Time with friends I'd unintentionally neglected. Long walks without constantly checking my phone. Small things. Simple things. But meaningful. For months, I focused less on finding answers and more on understanding why I'd spent so long avoiding them. The uncomfortable truth became increasingly obvious. The biggest problem hadn't been Ryan. It hadn't been Daniel. It hadn't even been Ethan. The biggest problem was my refusal to confront difficult realities when they first appeared. I ignored dissatisfaction, avoided uncomfortable conversations, delayed necessary decisions, then acted surprised when those problems grew larger. That pattern existed long before any of the relationships in this story. Recognizing it changed how I viewed everything, including myself. About 6 months after the separation, I unexpectedly ran into Daniel. Not planned. Not arranged. Completely random. I was attending a professional event in another city when I spotted him across the venue. For a brief moment, both of us froze, then laughed. The awkwardness disappeared almost immediately. We spent an hour catching up, talking about work, life, travel, everything we'd missed. What surprised me most was how different the interaction felt. Not bad, not painful, just different. The emotional intensity that had once dominated our conversations was gone. In its place was perspective, distance, clarity. Eventually, Daniel smiled and said something interesting. "You seem happier." The comment caught me off guard, because nobody had asked that question in months. I considered the answer carefully, then nodded. "I think I am." And I meant it. Not because life had become perfect. Because I finally felt aligned with it. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't living between competing possibilities. I was simply living. Before leaving, Daniel admitted something. "I think we both idealized each other a little." I laughed. "A little?" He laughed too. "Okay. Maybe more than a little." The honesty felt refreshing. Neither of us needed fantasy anymore. Reality was enough. We exchanged a friendly goodbye and went our separate ways. No dramatic reunion. No rekindled romance. Just closure. The healthy kind. A few weeks later, I met Ryan for coffee. By then, we'd both moved into different roles within the company. We spoke less frequently than before. Life had continued, as it always does. After discussing work for a while, Ryan asked, "So, any regrets?" I smiled. "What kind?" "The whole story." The question deserved thought. There were obvious things I regretted. The dishonesty. The avoidance. The unnecessary pain. Hurting Ethan. Allowing confusion to become deception. Those things mattered. A lot. But after a long pause, I answered honestly. "I regret how I handled things." Ryan nodded. "Fair. But I don't regret learning the truth." He raised an eyebrow. "What truth?" I looked out the window for a moment, thinking, then answered, "That ignoring problems doesn't protect relationships. It doesn't. It only delays reality. Sometimes for months. Sometimes for years. Eventually reality arrives anyway. And when it does, it's usually more painful than an honest conversation would have been." Ryan smiled. "That's actually a pretty good lesson." Maybe it was. Months later, Ethan and I spoke again briefly. Not about reconciliation. Not about getting back together. Just life. Two people who had once shared an important chapter. Nothing more. Nothing less. The conversation felt surprisingly normal. Healthy even. Before ending the call, he said something that stayed with me. "We probably held on too long." I thought about it afterward, and eventually realized he was right. Not because our relationship wasn't meaningful. It absolutely was. But sometimes people outgrow situations long before they're willing to admit it. That doesn't erase the good memories. It simply explains why certain chapters end. Looking back now, I understand something I couldn't see during the chaos. The story was never really about two men. It wasn't about choosing between Ethan and Daniel, or between stability and excitement, or between familiarity and possibility. The story was about honesty. Specifically, what happens when you avoid it. Every major problem came from the same source: refusing to acknowledge reality when it first appeared. Once I finally stopped doing that, everything became simpler. Not easier. Simpler. There's a difference. Today, my life looks completely different than it did when this story began. Different routines, different priorities, different perspective. And that's okay. Because growth rarely feels comfortable while it's happening. Most of the time it feels messy, confusing, painful. Exactly like this story. If there's one thing I learned, it's this. The hardest conversations in life are usually the ones we need most. Avoiding them doesn't make them disappear. It only gives them time to grow. And sometimes, the bravest thing you can do isn't choosing between two people. It's being honest enough to stop hiding from yourself. Yendi.